Welcome. The key concept for this video is corporate advantage. We'll be talking about corporate advantage, what it is, how it comes about. We'll also be talking about a couple other concepts that are necessary to kind of lay the foundation for this, as well as talk about upcoming concepts that will be important for understanding when you will or will not have corporate advantage. So one concept that you need to know a little bit about in order to better understand corporate advantage is competitive advantage. So competitive advantage is for individual business unit or individual business performance. And this competitive advantage comes about when they're able to create a willingness to pay gap between, a value gap between their willingness to pay and the opportunity cost of creating whatever it is they're selling. So every business that's producing something has some willingness to pay for their customers, as well as the opportunity cost of creating that offering. Ideally, that willingness to pay will exceed the opportunity cost. That's how you create value. And competitive advantage exists when you have a greater gap between willingness to pay and cost than your competitors. This might be because you're able to have a higher willingness to pay. It might be because your costs are lower. It might be because both your willingness to pay and your costs are lower. All of those are ways to create value. And you've probably heard of those previously in terms of generic strategies for business strategy. So we'll continue on from here. Corporate advantage is a little bit different than competitive advantage because it's about a firm with multiple businesses within them. And the goal of corporate advantage is to have the value of these pieces together be worth more than the sum of what they would be if they were not part of the same organization. There are two different ways of achieving that. One is portfolio assembly. This is a selection approach where you are trying to identify businesses that might be undervalued in some way, or perhaps the combination of them will reduce unsystematic risk for you. From a corporate strategy perspective, this is not really what we'll be talking about in terms of corporate advantage. Diversifying, creating some sort of diversified portfolio within the firm is not typically valuable to shareholders, particularly if you have efficient capital markets. So in that case, you should not need as much cross-subsidization or anything like that. So this is not a real great way to create value. You can think of corporate advantage through portfolio assembly as trying to beat an index. So your customers can diversify their investments very easily by buying a low-cost index fund. If you try to replicate that advantage by buying entire companies and combining them into a single company, that's not likely to create a lot of value. It's very expensive to buy companies, much cheaper to buy an index fund that has many companies as part of it. The other way of achieving corporate advantage is through business modification. This is the synergy approach to creating value. And as I mentioned, with corporate advantage versus competitive advantage, the goal with the business modification approach is to increase revenue or decrease costs at the firm level. And increasing that revenue might happen with higher willingness to pay. Perhaps you are keeping the price down, but getting more volume based on that high willingness to pay. Alternatively, you can raise the price and get a higher margin per product. So either of those allows you to create corporate advantage. There may be some ways to reduce risk as well through the combination of businesses and creating operational synergies between them. But primarily, we'll be talking about other ways of creating value that directly increase willingness to pay or decrease costs. An important thing to remember about this business modification approach, or synergies, is that synergies are not the same thing as corporate advantage. The corporate advantage can exist with these synergies. But the key concept when you interact corporate advantage with synergies is that the corporate advantage exists when the synergies create the same value, either within or outside the firm, but at a lower governance cost within the firm as opposed to outside the firm. An important thing to know about corporate advantage is that it's a goal, it's not a measure. This is not something that you can sit down and calculate whether or not you have corporate advantage. This is often attempted in finance by taking a sum of the parts analysis of an organization. So you might break down each of the individual businesses within the organization and say this is how profitable they would be if they were on a standalone basis, and this is how valuable they are working together within the same firm. The challenge with that is with synergies, the costs or willingness to pay will be higher based on the fact that they're in the same firm and working together. So it would be very difficult to say if this same business existed as a standalone business, what that would actually look like, what those revenues or costs might be. Despite that, it is, again, common to try to do a sum of the parts analysis. So there was recently a news article about Prudential, which has two main business units. One sells products in the United States, and the other is based in Hong Kong and sells a different mix of products in different countries to different types of customers. So the firm is thinking about splitting these two businesses apart to increase value for shareholders. Part of the goal or the reason for this is that if you do a sum of the parts analysis and look at what each of those businesses might be worth holding their revenues and profits constant, it seems like they individually would be worth more in total than the current business is worth. So does it make sense to split them up? It may or may not, but from a corporate strategy perspective, the question that's actually important is what types of synergies create value between these two business units, and whether that same value can be created better within the single firm, or if that same value can be created at lower costs by having two independent businesses working together. So for the rest of this course on corporate strategy, we'll really be focused on the question of synergies, and in particular, whether or not the synergies are best created within a firm or between firms. And again, that gets to the question of governance costs. So if you can create the same value within the firm or outside the firm, but it's cheaper to do one versus the other, that should guide your choice in terms of defining the scope of your firm. This is another way of visualizing this. This is a concept that we'll be returning to many times in the future, but two factors that can drive governance costs are resource modification. So if you have two businesses working together and you need to modify the resources in one in order to create value with the other, that can create challenges if you're trying to have two independent businesses coordinate that. It can be cheaper to do that within a single firm. Similarly, if the synergies are asymmetric, so that one business unit is incurring the cost and the benefit is realized in the other business unit, if they're both in the same firm, that can maximize firm level profit, but coordinating that between independent firms can get complicated. So when those two factors are high, that tends to increase transaction costs more quickly than ownership costs. And the gap between transaction costs and ownership costs is corporate advantage if those two businesses are within a single firm. So again, that corporate advantage exists when synergies are being created, but they're being created at a lower cost within the firm as opposed to between firms.